A soldier who never fired a single shot in combat, who died in a training fort in Queens, New York, just 20 days after enlisting, became the namesake of an American Legion post. And according to the research we're discussing today, he may have been one of the earliest victims of the deadliest pandemic in human history. Today, we're diving into the post-historian's research on Atley Hiram Cook and the founding of American Legion Post 70 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how one family's story, two brothers, one war, one who never made it to the front, became the foundation of a veterans community, and why the men who built that community chose to name it after the first to fall. I'm joined by someone who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start right at the beginning. April 1917, Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
So picture this. It's a small Midwestern city, the kind of place where news travels fast because everyone knows everyone. And when word breaks in April 1917 that America has declared war on Germany, the research describes it spreading through Oshkosh, and I'm quoting here, with the speed of electricity and the intimacy of a small Midwestern city. Newsboys are shouting headlines. Men are clustering under the awnings of Main Street storefronts to read bulletins tacked to windows. And within hours, the local newspapers' presses are running extra editions.
That's such a vivid image. It's almost hard to imagine now, that kind of collective, immediate, physical response to news.
Right, and the research makes clear that for many men in Oshkosh, the next step was almost instinctive. They walked together, as in literally with their neighbors, to the Winnebago County Draft Board office or the local National Guard Armory on Court Street, where enlistment tables had been quickly set up. Some joined existing Wisconsin National Guard companies. Others registered for the draft with what the research calls the same quiet resolve their fathers had shown in 1861.
And that's where the Cook brothers enter the story.
Exactly. Atley Hiram Cook and Arthur Kenneth Cook, brothers, both from Oshkosh. Atley was born in 1894, so he's 23 when war is declared. And upon hearing the news on April 6, 1917, both brothers decide to enlist voluntarily before the Selective Service Act even formalized the draft on May 18th. They're not waiting to be called. They're going.
And they go in different directions, don't they? They don't end up in the same unit.
They don't, no. And that divergence is actually quite significant for the story. Atley chooses the regular Army's Coast Artillery Corps. The research suggests he was drawn to its defensive role. He signs his enlistment papers on May 1st, 1917, at a local recruiting station, possibly in the city's post office or a temporary setup amid the enlistment drives. He's quickly processed and assigned to basic training at Fort Totten in Queens, New York.
Fort Totten, that's a long way from Oshkosh.
About 900 miles, according to the research. The likely route was a Chicago and Northwestern Railway train south from Oshkosh to Chicago, then transferring to a New York Central line eastward through Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania to New York City, and then a short local train or ferry across the East River to the fort on Willets Point. A journey of 2 to 3 days, amid troop transports swelling with recruits.
And Arthur? Where does he go?
Arthur enlists on May 7th, 1917, in Marshfield, home to a local Wisconsin National Guard armory, and joins what would become the 127th Infantry Regiment, part of the 32nd Division. He eventually rises to Sergeant of Ordnance in its headquarters company. His path is very different from Atley's. He undergoes initial drills at a nearby state camp. Then in late September, his unit boards trains for Camp MacArthur near Waco, Texas, the division's designated training site.
So one brother heads east to a coastal artillery fort in New York, and the other heads south to a massive infantry training camp in Texas. And this is all happening within weeks of each other.
Within weeks, yes. And the research paints a really striking picture of what Camp MacArthur was like. It's a 10,700-acre camp. A typical day begins before dawn with reveille around 5:30 in the morning. After a hasty wash in communal basins and breakfast of coffee, hardtack, and beans, the men assemble for roll call and calisthenics. Then, the bulk of the day is bayonet drills, trench warfare simulations in mock dugouts, rifle marksmanship on the firing range. Afternoons might include gas mask training, donning cumbersome hoods in chlorine-filled tents, followed by marches of up to 20 miles with full packs.
20 miles with a full pack in Texas heat.
In Texas heat, yes. And this is the world Arthur Cook is entering. 16 weeks of that routine before graduation. Meanwhile, his brother Atley has arrived at Fort Totten in New York. And this is where the story takes a devastating turn.
Tell me what happens.
Atley Cook is taken sick on May 26, 1917, just 25 days after enlisting, and he dies the following day, May 27th. The Winnebago War Mothers History Committee, which documented every Oshkosh man who served, recorded it with quiet precision. He died of septic pneumonia and septic endocarditis. And then they added this line, the first Oshkosh boy to give his life for his country.
20 days after enlisting, he never made it to the front. He never even completed basic training.
Never made it to the front. And the research, this is where it becomes genuinely remarkable. The post-historian doesn't just record the death. The research goes deep into what may have actually killed Atley Cook. And the hypothesis is extraordinary.
Go on.
The research raises the possibility that Atley Cook was among the earliest casualties of the H1N1 pandemic, what we commonly call the Spanish flu. But here's the thing. Modern pathologists have since confirmed that the global flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 actually began earlier in Kansas and communicated across the globe on the trains and ships supplying the warring nations of Europe. The virus was zoonotic, meaning it originated in livestock and leaped to humans.
Wait, so the Spanish flu may have been circulating as early as 1917?
That's precisely what the research suggests. And the key piece of evidence is something called shipping fever, an outbreak of respiratory disease that confirms the connection between cattle cars and the communication of a new virus strain as early as 1915. By 1917, the research argues the virus had made the leap from animal to human.
And the connection to Atley specifically, how does that work?
This is where it gets really striking. The research points out that the Coast Artillery Corps, the very unit Atley chose to join, was served by horse and mule trains. Artillery units of that era were entirely dependent on animals. Man and beast, working side by side under what the research calls the most unhygienic circumstances. And the massive transatlantic shipment of horses and mules from North America to Europe, we're talking hundreds of thousands of animals, created ideal conditions for outbreaks of shipping fever, with symptoms including fever, nasal discharge, coughing, and pneumonia.
So the very logistics of the war effort, moving all these animals, may have been the mechanism by which the virus spread.
Exactly. And the research is careful to note that in 1917, the existence and role of bacteria had been known for only about 10 years. Viruses wouldn't be discovered until 1931. So when Atley's death was recorded as septic pneumonia and septic endocarditis, that was the best diagnostic language available. But the pathology of the H1N1 disease process, as we now understand it, is twofold. The virus infects the lungs, the immune system overreacts and floods the lungs, and in that weakened state, naturally occurring bacteria take over, causing the pneumonia of record. Once the lungs are overwhelmed, the infection spreads through the blood to the heart.
Which is precisely what the records show happened to Atley. Septic pneumonia, the lungs, and septic endocarditis, the heart.
Precisely. And the research notes something else that's chilling. The H1N1 pandemic had an unusual age pattern. It disproportionately killed young adults, not the elderly, not the very young, but people in their prime. Atley Cook was 23 years old. The research puts it plainly, he was, tragically, a prime candidate for infection and fatal outcome.
I want to pause on that for a moment because I think it's easy to hear died of pneumonia in training and file it away as a sad footnote. But what the research is actually suggesting is that this young man from Oshkosh may have been on the very leading edge of a pandemic that would go on to kill 50 million people.
50 million lives, yes, that's the figure the research cites for the 1917 to 1920 pandemic. And the research is appropriately cautious. It acknowledges there's no definitive proof of a direct causal link between the equine shipping fever outbreaks and the H1N1 pandemic. But the hypothesis is bolstered by historical equine flu events, by the contemporaneous reports of severe respiratory illness in horses mirroring early human cases, and by the wartime movements of troops and animals that likely amplified transmission.
It's a remarkable piece of historical detective work. Now, while all of this is happening, while Atley is dying in New York, Arthur is still training. And eventually Arthur goes to war. Let's talk about what that actually looked like.
Right. So Arthur's unit, the 32nd Division, is itself a fascinating story. It's created in the autumn of 1917 by combining roughly 15,000 Wisconsin National Guard soldiers with about 8,000 Michigan National Guard soldiers, plus later additions of around 4,000 National Army draftees from Camp Custer in Michigan and Camp Grant in Illinois, along with replacements from nearly every state.
And the number 32, there's something interesting there, isn't there? For Oshkosh specifically.
There is, and the research is quite lovely about this. The Army's numbering system was purely administrative, sequential, no symbolic intent whatsoever. Wisconsin and Michigan units were grouped together for reasons of geography and manpower, and their combined formation simply received the next available National Guard number, 32, a matter of administrative necessity, not commemorative design.
But for Oshkosh,
the research says, this bureaucratic coincidence must have felt like something far more meaningful, because Oshkosh's Civil War identity was deeply tied to the 32nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which had marched out of Camp Bragg in 1862, carrying the hopes of Winnebago County into the Western Theater. More than 50 years later, when newspapers announced that Wisconsin's new National Guard division would be the 32nd, residents couldn't help but see a thread of continuity. The research puts it beautifully. The Army may have assigned 32 by chance, but in the hearts of Oshkosh residents, it became a bridge across time.
That's a genuinely moving detail. The number that meant nothing to a War Department clerk meant everything to a city.
Exactly. And the division that bore that number went on to earn a reputation that justified every bit of that civic pride. General Pershing had adopted what the research calls a square division structure: 2 infantry brigades per division, 2 infantry regiments per brigade, 3 battalions per regiment, 4 rifle companies per battalion, authorized strength of roughly 991 officers and 27,114 men per division. It was a massive formation designed for sustained offensive power.
And Pershing had a specific doctrine he wanted to apply: open warfare, aggressive infantry maneuver. How did that hold up against the reality of the Western Front?
It's a fascinating tension in the research. Pershing's doctrine emphasized aggressive infantry maneuver, marksmanship, bayonet attacks. The goal was to break out of the trench stalemate into mobile warfare. But the Western Front in 1918 was dominated by artillery, machine guns, wire, and deep defensive zones. American divisions, including the 32nd, had to adapt quickly to set-piece attacks, creeping barrages, and combined arms, often under French and British tutelage.
So the theory and the practice were quite different.
Quite different. And the 32nd Division's war diary, which the research follows in detail, shows exactly how that adaptation played out. The division arrives in France in February 1918, moves to training areas in the Vosges region for final AEF training under French tutelage, and then in May and June is assigned to a quiet sector in Alsace to gain trench experience. Raids, patrols, artillery duels, gas attacks, casualties, but no major offensive operations. This is Arthur Cook's first likely combat exposure.
And then things escalate significantly.
Dramatically. In mid-July 1918, the 32nd is rushed from Alsace to the Aisne-Marne front as part of the Allied counteroffensive against the last major German push. By late July and into August, the division is attacking near Fismes and Fismet, fighting through woods, ravines, and fortified villages. The 127th Infantry, Arthur's regiment, is heavily engaged in what the research describes as brutal, close-quarters fighting. The division advances 19 kilometers in 7 days during the Marne counteroffensive.
19 kilometers in 7 days. That's extraordinary for that kind of warfare.
It is. And it's in this period that the French begin calling them Les Terribles. French officers of General Charles Mangin's 10th Army, officers who had seen elite colonial and metropolitan units break under similar pressure, began using this term for the Americans from Wisconsin and Michigan. Not in the modern English sense of terrible, but in the older French military sense, fearsome, formidable, unstoppable. The nickname appears repeatedly in French after-action reports, praising the division's refusal to yield ground.
That's a remarkable thing, to be nicknamed by the people you're fighting alongside in their own language for your ferocity.
And then comes the Oise-et-Na campaign in August and September, where the 32nd breaks through the German line, forcing their retreat to fallback positions. Both regiments conduct repeated assaults, often under heavy machine gun and artillery fire. And it's here that the second name emerges, the Red Arrow Division. The division smashes through the German positions protecting the Chemin des Dames, a line the French had failed to pierce in earlier campaigns.
And the red arrow insignia, where does that come from exactly?
The research is very clear on this. Their success in breaching the Hindenburg Line in October 1918 cemented the symbolism. A red arrow shot clean through a solid bar, representing the division's ability to pierce every line placed before it. This insignia was formally adopted after the war and became the division's enduring emblem. The 32nd was the first Allied division to pierce the Hindenburg Line. That's the claim the research makes, and it's the claim that gave the arrow its meaning.
So Arthur Cook is part of all of this, the Eismarn, the Ois-Eisner, and then the Meuse-Argonne. That's the final campaign.
The Meuse-Argonne is what the research calls the most intense and defining combat of his service. The 32nd Division is ordered to 1st Army Reserve near Verdun in late September. Night marches bring the division into position. By early October, the 63rd Brigade, which includes the 127th Infantry, relieves the 37th Division near Sierge, and the division holds a front under intense fire. Then come continuous attacks through Vauquois, Romaine, and other fortified positions, fighting alongside the 1st Division and other AEF units, pushing toward the Kriemhilde-Stellung, part of the Hindenburg Line.
And then November 11th.
And then November 11th. The research has a passage about the hours before the armistice that I find genuinely moving. The men of the 127th Infantry are exhausted, mud-soaked, and hollow-eyed from weeks of relentless fighting. Rumors of peace had circulated for days, but the regiment had learned not to trust rumors. Too many times the enemy had counterattacked just when relief seemed near. As dawn broke on the 11th, the men were still under orders, still advancing, still taking fire.
Still taking fire on the last morning of the war.
Still taking fire. Officers of the 127th moved among their companies, reminding them that the armistice would not take effect until 11 o'clock, and that vigilance was still essential. Some men wrote quick notes home. Others simply stared into the fog, listening for the last shells they hoped never to hear again. And then, when the moment finally came, the 11th hour of the 11th day, the research says the silence was so sudden it felt unreal. Men of the 127th later recalled that birds could be heard again, and that the absence of artillery was almost frightening in its completeness.
Birds could be heard again. That detail, I think that says more than any statistic could.
It does. Some cheered, others wept, many simply sat down where they stood, and the research is honest about what they carried into that silence. Not triumph alone, but the weight of everything they had endured, and the knowledge that comrades had fallen even in the war's last hours.
And then comes the long road home. What does Arthur Cook's return look like?
Arthur leaves Germany on April 25, 1919, as part of the massive post-armistice repatriation effort that moved more than 1 million American soldiers back to the United States. The research identifies the USS Patricia, a former Hamburg America liner surrendered to the United States and used specifically to repatriate American expeditionary forces, as the most historically plausible ship for his return. Patricia completed multiple return voyages that spring, including one in April carrying nearly 3,000 troops from Brest to Boston.
A German ship repurposed to bring American soldiers home. There's something almost poetic about that.
There is. Arthur arrives in the United States on May 5, 1919, consistent with the typical 10 to 12-day Atlantic crossing. He's processed at Camp Devens in Massachusetts, medical inspection, pay settlement, equipment turn-in, and receives his discharge on May 18, 1919. Then the long rail journey back, Boston to Albany, Albany to Buffalo and Cleveland and Chicago on the New York Central's water level route, and then the final leg to Oshkosh on the Chicago and Northwestern Railway.
The same railway line his brother Atley had taken east 2 years earlier.
The same line, in the opposite direction. And the research describes what he comes home to, a city still vibrating with patriotic pride and relief. Families gathered at the Chicago and Northwestern Depot with flags, flowers, and hastily painted signs. The depot itself often became an impromptu celebration space, with the city band appearing when word spread that a group of soldiers was due in.
And there's a victory arch, isn't there? The research mentions that.
Yes, a victory arch on Main Street. Arthur's arrival in early May places him just days before the city's most visible public celebration, the march of Company C of the 150th Machine Gun Battalion beneath the newly constructed Victory Arch on May 16, 1919. Arthur's own homecoming doesn't coincide with that formal procession, but the research imagines him walking past the arch in the days leading up to it, seeing carpenters and volunteers and city workers preparing the structure that symbolized Oshkosh's pride in its returning soldiers.
And all of this, the homecoming, the arch, the celebrations, is happening against the backdrop of Atley's absence.
That's the emotional core of the research, I think. The homecoming that Arthur received, the flags at the depot, the embraces, the relief in his family's eyes, was precisely the homecoming Atley never lived to see. The research puts it directly. For Arthur, the joy of coming home was inseparable from the memory of the brother who should have been standing beside him. Passing the Victory Arch, watching the May 16th parade, Arthur would have felt the weight of that absence as sharply as any returning soldier who had left a brother behind.
And then, just a few months later, something significant happens in Oshkosh.
On October 2nd, 1919, Arthur Cook is among the many men who attend the first meeting and rally of Post 70 of the newly formed American Legion in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. The American Legion itself had been founded earlier that year. The Paris Caucus of March 15th to 17th, 1919, was the decisive moment when veterans of the American Expeditionary Forces transformed their wartime camaraderie into a permanent national organization. Called by officers including Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Lieutenant Colonel Eric Fisher Wood, and Major Bennett Champ Clark, the caucus convened what needed hundreds of delegates to address the urgent needs of returning soldiers, fair treatment, medical care, employment, and a unified voice in national affairs.
And when Oshkosh's veterans formed their post, they had to choose a name. And they chose Atley Hiram Cook.
They chose Atley Hiram Cook. The War Mothers Committee and the World War I veterans who founded Post 70 chose to name it after the first Oshkosh man to give his life during World War I. Not a battlefield hero, not a decorated officer. A 23-year-old from Oshkosh who signed his enlistment papers on May 1st, 1917, boarded a train east and was dead 26 days later, before he ever completed basic training, before he ever saw France, before the war had barely begun.
And that choice, naming the post after Atley, says something profound about what those founders believed service and sacrifice actually meant.
It does. The research frames the entire document around this theme, the first to fall. And the point is that falling doesn't require a battlefield. Atley Cook answered the call. He left his city, he took the oath, he reported for duty, and he gave his life in the service of his country, even if the enemy that killed him wasn't German artillery, but a virus that the medicine of his day couldn't even name properly.
So when you step back from everything the research covers, the Cook brothers, the 32nd Division, the war diary, the homecoming, the founding of Post 70, what does it all really come down to?
I think it comes down to this. The research is a war diary of a soldier who never made it to the front. That's how the Post historian frames it. And what makes it remarkable is that the veterans who founded Post 70 understood something that's easy to miss, that the measure of service isn't the distance you travel or the battles you fight, it's the willingness to go. Atley Cook was willing. He went, and he didn't come back.
And the research also gives us something else. This extraordinary hypothesis about Atley's death potentially connecting to the origins of the H1N1 pandemic, which means that this one young man's story sits at the intersection of two of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century, the First World War and the 1918 flu pandemic.
And that's what makes the Post historian's research so valuable. It doesn't just document a name on a Post's charter, it asks why. It follows the evidence, the trains, the horses, the virus, the pathology, and it arrives at a conclusion that reframes Atley Cook's death not as a sad footnote, but as a historically significant moment. The first Oshkosh man to give his life for his country may also have been among the first Americans to fall to a pandemic that the world wouldn't fully reckon with for another year.
And Arthur, who survived all of it, who came home, who stood in that meeting on October 2nd, 1919, and helped found Post 70, he would have known all of this. He would have known what his brother's name on that post meant.
He would have known. And the research ends with that image. Arthur Cook, newly returned from a war that had taken him from Marshfield to Waco to France to Germany and back again, walking into a room full of men who had all crossed the same ocean and helping to build something that would honor every one of them, including the brother who never got to cross it.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. The research of the Post historian gives us something that official histories rarely do. It gives us the human scale of a world war. Not the grand strategy, not the casualty figures, but two brothers from a small Midwestern city who heard the news on April 6th, 1917, and walked toward the enlistment tables. One of them died before the war had barely started. The other survived some of the most brutal fighting of the entire conflict. And the community they came from, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, chose to remember them both by naming a veterans post after the one who fell first.
And that act of naming, that deliberate choice by the War Mothers Committee and the founding veterans, is itself a kind of argument. An argument that sacrifice doesn't require a front line, that the first to fall deserves to be remembered as fully as the last to come home.